All right, 42-24, USC over Stanford. David Lombardi, RJ Abadia with you on the roof of the Coliseum as they're changing the end zones here from USC Cardinal and gold to Los Angeles Rams text and colors. Kind of a surreal feeling here. And you know what was, I thought, most surreal to me, and I think RJ, this is something that you could probably relate to and view in a different perspective. Stanford really just getting stomped, unable to provide resistance at the line of scrimmage against USC. That's something that to me is foreign, but probably may give you a sense of deja vu to way back.
Well, thanks for that. I think you just took a really long time to say that you think I'm really old, yes. But yeah, thanks for that. Well, I'd take it a step further. If you look at Stanford and USC tonight, you saw one team who was very dependent on big plays, like 75-yard runs, and who also was victimized by some very untimely penalties. What was different about tonight is the team I'm describing was Stanford. You know, I think, again, I am not someone who is in the one play was the end of the situation, but I think you brought up, and Coach Shaw brought up a few moments ago in his press conference, the illegal procedure play that negated a pass from Keller Chris to Connor Weddington that would have put the ball at Stanford's 1 yard line, or excuse me, at the USC 1 yard line. And, you know, timely penalties, and USC did have some bad penalties, maybe some questionable calls too, but in the end of the day, yeah, I think role reversal is where we have to go when we talk about this game, and the biggest role reversal of them all was USC's run game just breaking Stanford's defense in half. I mean, this was Bane lifting Batman up and just snapping him in the back. I mean, they had 200-yard rushers. The total yardage count today
307
was 300. That's just rushing,
yes.
right?
Oh,
USC put up 623 yards of total offense, and you know, I'm a big stats guy. I think everybody kind of does at this point, and I prefer to look at yards per play. I know you like to give that a lot of weight as well, but in this case, as you tweeted out a little while ago, it's not actually instructive to look at the yards per rush because Stanford, by a little margin, actually outrushed USC per rush.
For that, I think that does give us a little perspective on this game. I think Stanford ran the ball really well too, but they didn't have the counterbalance of a consistent passing threat, and that's what USC had. So, right, you look at the yards per rush, USC is 6.4, Stanford actually a little bit better at 6.5. Obviously, you could argue that the 70-yard Bryce Love touchdown pushed them over the top of USC, but hey, a 70-yard touchdown happened.
It counts the same.
It counts in the average. The difference in this game is yards per attempt passing-wise. That's where the Trojans doubled Stanford up. 12.2 for USC, 6.1 for Stanford. That shows a passing game that is explosive and was awesome today. Sam Darnold was great. His receivers, Deontay Burnett, was making diving catches all over the place. And a passing game that did some good things for Stanford, but nowhere near enough to make this a sustainable operation in a shootout. And they needed to win in a shootout today because that defense, you look at those numbers, that's a war zone right there. USC just tore through them.
Yeah, Stanford took nothing away. They didn't take away the short passing game. They didn't take away the deep passing game. They didn't take away the run game. And so you're right. The template was going to have to be outscoring USC. And frankly, USC is far better built right now to outscore teams than Stanford is. And I would say, the point you made about the difference being in the passing game, I think it's going to be really easy for people to look at it as matching up with the difference between Keller Chris and Sam Darnold. And yeah, there's a difference, but I also think it was something that really showed the difference along the line. I think Stanford's offensive line did have a strong showing in terms of the run game, but I think once USC got up by 10, 14, and USC could focus on just, as Coach Shaw said, the old cliche, pinning their ears back, I think once they were able to focus on pressuring, Stanford's offensive line did not hold up under the pass protection. And so we can talk a little bit more in detail about Chris, but yeah, passing game, yes, but I think way more than just the difference between Sam Darnold and Keller.
Well, and I think you make a great point. I think, Stanford is a team. I hate this cliche because what team isn't built to play with a lead?
Right. Yeah, I hate it when people say that too. Yes. Yeah, it's like, yeah.
In this game here, I thought that the fact that USC controlled the scoreboard and thus the tempo here, because Stanford blinked a couple times early,
yep,
that put Stanford behind the 8-ball when they had the worst pass protection and the worst quarterback in this game.
Yes.
And if they were to win this football game with the worst defensive line too, I thought that they needed to get their couple interceptions. They had 2 of those, which were huge. I thought the secondary came and saved them a couple times. This could have been a much bigger margin earlier.
Agree.
They would have gotten, those 2 picks a little bit earlier, and obviously that wasn't going to happen. You could say if forever, but it didn't happen. But if that would have happened, then maybe they have a chance of playing this one from ahead, and maybe you could, negate that pass rush a little bit from USC, and maybe Keller Christ is more comfortable. Obviously, that's not how this went, because USC was the better team tonight. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we're looking forward in the macro sense, I feel very confident that Stanford can close the ground between USC and itself right now. I didn't see any evidence tonight that Stanford can catch and pass USC as a team. I think Stanford can get much better, and I think they can still have a really good season. But this was USC at their best, and I'm not sure Stanford at their best looks quite this good. What do you think?
Yeah, well, so I think offensively Stanford is loaded with a lot of weapons. Now, one of the tweets I pointed out was, somebody told me, oh, Stanford doesn't have the weapons to beat USC in the shootout. I think that's bold. I think that Stanford, they have 6-7 guys down there lined up against 5'10" cornerbacks. They have fast guys like Connor Weddington. They have, Trent Irwin was making great catches, great routes out there too. He's dependable on third down. And they had the fastest guy on the field in Bryce Love. So Stanford has enough weapons. My question was, do they have the quarterback, and then obviously also the offensive line, as you just mentioned, to allow those weapons to consistently deliver? So I don't think that's an issue. This is not a shortage of firepower for Stanford. I think the offense can grow as the season goes along. Where I think there's a ceiling is on the defensive side of the ball. And, maybe that's a ceiling that raises next season. But they're playing a lot of young guys who, are not up to the standard of play that we've grown accustomed to along the defensive line. And, today it seemed like an automatic 10 yards in big situations, especially when USC was backed up against their own goal line. Jake Bailey, Stanford's punter, was phenomenal. Again, he's pushing them back there to the 3-yard line a few times. Every single time when everybody in the stadium here in the Coliseum knew that USC was going to run the football, to avoid, risking a turnover down there, that was a 12-yard push. So when push came to shove today, the Stanford defensive line was not getting anything against the run. I think USC went 10 of 12 on third down.
Yeah.
And that's what, I think should concern Stanford fans. And to be quite honest, that's what should have concerned them after the game against Rice. There was nothing positive, really, I think, to be gleaned by beating up against Rice, but the one negative thing that we were all worried about was they're not getting that much push against a bad team on the defensive line, and that really reared its ugly head tonight.
Well, and again, we're back to the themes of role reversal, right? Because how many games has Stanford salted away simply by running the ball, by putting it right down the other team's throats, and by getting better defensively as the game goes on? These are all talking points we've used with Stanford for a long, long time. And give credit to USC. I think, a lot of people who cover USC and watch USC have said for a long time, if they would just stay with the running game. I mean, that was kind of a storyline last year when Stanford played USC. But if they just stay with it, I think tonight we saw what happens when USC stays with the run and has an elite quarterback. And again, that puts you in a tough spot. And I think Stanford, again, if you're looking at Stanford, and let's just go by, group by group, right? I am very confident that the wide receiver group is going to get better and better as this year goes on. I'm very confident about the tight end group, the running back group. I'm even confident that, look, if Keller Christ just plays all the way through this season, I think he's going to be a better quarterback 5 games from now, 10 games from now. I think he is. He would have needed to have been Andrew Luck tonight, and that's not unfair. That's unfair to expect him at any point. But when you get back to that defense and you look at the secondary, where, again, I put them in the same category. I think they're going to be elite and good all year long. But the front 7, and I think it does. I think if there's a takeaway that's a little discouraging is that we were like, we have questions. Stanford has questions on the defensive line. Tonight they have questions on the defensive line, and despite David Shaw's one-word answer to my query about the linebackers, they've got questions at linebacker now too.
Oh, yeah. You don't get gashed like that. You don't get pushed back like that, having a problem at only one of the two front seven positions. I think both levels there were issues. There were issues getting to the edge. There were several times they got burned out to the edge, and there were issues on the interior. And then you combine that with Sam Darnold, the quarterback who could pick his poison on any given down and roll out when he needs to and step up when he needs to. You're behind the 8 ball if you're the Stanford secondary. And they still made a couple very nice plays. You had the Justin Reed interception, and then you had the Elijah Holder interception later in this game. And I mean, those were 2 plays that you look at and say, wow, you talk about the role reversal. Tell somebody who didn't know anything about Stanford football, had been frozen in carbonite, let's put it that way.
Indeed, let's do.
For the last 10 years, and said that there were 2 teams on the field at the Coliseum. Maybe not 10 years. Let's rewind back to when Stanford was bullying teams in 2009. Say somebody hadn't seen anything since then, and tell him that there was one team that looked pretty soft up front that was begging the other team not to run power anymore. That might have been Stanford, right? And then there was another team that, if you look at the same game, there's a team with a great defensive back play and the fastest guy on the field, and they would say, oh, well, that's probably USC, right? No, that was Stanford. Stanford was the fast team that had the dam break on them along the front 7 today.
Yeah,
and USC ran their formula.
And bringing up what's your deal, I had that exact thought during the game. Now, USC doesn't have a formula play like Power was for that Stanford team, but if Stanford didn't verbally say stop running this play, it certainly looked like their body language was saying it. I mean, they were beat. They were just beat down, much the way that Stanford beat USC in 2009. And I think if you watch the nature of the USC runs too, and this is where I think you have to raise concern about both of the first 2 levels of the defense. In the first half, it was the first hole where Stanford was getting beat. And then in the second half, they were getting gashed on cutbacks. Which is Stanford just selling out to stop that first place, that first gap, that first run, and leaving nobody home, or nobody being home. And again, no matter how you slice it, that's something that the linebackers have to be accountable for too. Now, the other thing that I think it's fair to talk about and question is, this defense is coached by Lance Anderson. And even given the hand that he's been given, I have a hard time believing they're not going to get better somewhere as the season goes on. And also, by the way, they're also not going to play too many teams that can do what USC can do.
He's the best quarterback they're going to face. We had our questions about Sam Darnold, especially after last week. He said himself that he played the worst game of his career against Western Michigan. You wonder about the sophomore slump. You wonder how he's going to do without all the targets that he had last year, but he got his main guy back, Deontay Burnett, and he was awesome today. So I think that tandem, you could see that they had been working together in the offseason. You could see that they're both going to be in the NFL. Luke Falk is on the schedule this year. Jake Browning is on the schedule, but I think Luke Falk, as I'm talking right now, just got benched against Boise State. I think Darnold's in a different class than these other Pac-12 quarterbacks. So I think that Stanford. Exactly where, you said this before we came on air, exactly where Stanford was weak, USC was extremely strong, and they punished them. And that was along the defensive line. That was kind of how we previewed this game. And USC exposed them for those weaknesses. And that's why we saw this role reversal. Not as extreme, we talked about this a little bit before too, but last season, Stanford beat USC by 17 points. They lost by 18 today, so on the scoreboard, nearly identical. I know the yardage was a little bit more in USC's favor today, but last year, Stanford, I thought, kicked the crap out of USC up front. I think they had something like 6.1 yards per carry before contact last year, and at no point during that game last year did I think that USC really had a shot at winning just because they were getting blasted off the ball and Stanford held the tempo. Reverse was true this year. At no point did I feel, even when Bryce Love erupted to tie the game on the 70-yard touchdown, I just felt it was tenuous the whole time for Stanford because the defense was not holding.
I think tenuous is exactly the word. it was discouraging when on consecutive Stanford touchdowns, USC came right back. If Stanford had been able to build a defensive stop off the momentum that they got from either of their first 2 touchdowns, then I think you have a different feel about this game. But this game very quickly had the feeling of Stanford on a tightrope, where they were scoring on every possession, and you felt that the moment that stopped, they weren't going to be able to win the game. What's interesting is that, if I'm not mistaken, and I won't be because I'm going to look at the game book to confirm it, but the third quarter was scoreless.
Yes.
So, Stanford goes into the locker room down 28-17, and a whole third quarter goes by, and it's not like Stanford shut USC down. They got the Elijah Holder interception. And by the way, let's also talk about that return, because he broke at least 3 tackles on that return and got it all the way back to the 34. That's a play that's going to get forgotten because of the score and the result. But any doubts you may have had about Elijah Holder being back, I think, are pretty much gone at this point.
But that's the theme here, and Coach Shaw talked about it too. We didn't score off of any of the 2 takeaways today. That's what Coach Shaw said. And if Stanford doesn't score off those takeaways, those are you're asking the defense to make a play. The defense is getting gashed. The front 7 isn't looking good. So, there is one elite component to your defense. That's the secondary. You say, please, guys, even though we're not giving you a pass rush, we're not giving you any run support, please, guys, give us a turnover. Give us 2 turnovers. And they did that today. And, in a game like this where nothing else is going right for the defense, you better capitalize the 1 or 2 times that it does go right for the defense. And they didn't. And, they go into halftime down 28-17, right? And we were talking about, Stanford needs to find a way to at least force USC to just kick field goals here in the second half or get a turnover, something. And Lance Anderson needs to make the adjustments that he usually does. And obviously he's playing, I think the deck of cards is much smaller for Lance Anderson than it has been in previous years. He still found a way to dial up whatever Stanford needed to shut USC out in that third quarter. It wasn't pretty. He did, but the offense did not take the torch when it needed to. And, to be honest, against a great team, great offense like Stanford played today, this year, I think Stanford's own offense is going to have a very slight margin for error. It's basically a reverse of what we saw in 2012, right? Where the defense gave the offense huge margin for error and the offense used almost all of it.
Yes.
But now the offense cannot be that bad. They're going to have to win some of these games in shootouts.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be the evolution of this team. I think there's no way that the Stanford defense is going to go from where it's at right now to elite. But I think there is a way for the Stanford offense to get from where it's at to being elite, or at least close, maybe a top 10, maybe top 15 nationally. I think the talent is there. I think personnel-wise, there are 2 groups, one on offense and one on defense, that I think is worth scrutinizing, and I think Stanford's going to have some conversations about. On offense, it's the offensive line. I'm not going to single out any individual player. Number one, I'm not going to do it. Secondly, another coaching cliche, but until you watch the film, it's very hard to grade out offensive linemen individually on their first time watching it. I mean, coaches don't do it, so there's no way I'm going to be able to do it. That being said, Stanford is not playing its 5 most talented offensive linemen, and given the fact that 2 of those 5 offensive linemen are freshmen whose red shirts have been burned, I think it's time to ramp up the discussion of getting to the point where Foster Sorrell and Walker Little are on the field for this team, because I believe both in the short and the long term, it is to the betterment of the team. The other side, and then you can respond to both, the other side of the ball, the group that I think needs some scrutiny is defense, just because there are options. On the defensive line, there's just nothing there. There's Eric Cotton, Dylan Jackson, Jovan Swan, and Mike Williams have to get better. There isn't going to be a combination. There isn't going to be a rising somebody who comes out of nowhere.
And you hope the maturity does that. You hope
right.
They have another year, and Lance Anderson has said, that probably one more year for these guys, but it's trial by fire. It's going to have to happen quicker if this team wants to get to where they want to be at some point this season.
Yeah, even if Stanford becomes an elite offense, this defense is still going to have to get itself off the field 3 or 4 times per game, preferably 3 or 4 times per half, but let's not get greedy. But again, I think that goes into talking about the linebackers, because Stanford rotated 6 guys, and we were told all off season that isn't happening again, to the point where Joey Alfieri was moved from his outside linebacking spot inside. Now, he may not be 100%. We have to allow for that possibility, but Joey Alfieri got moved to the outside tonight, and it wasn't because things were going so well for Stanford on the inside, and we saw multiple combinations of inside linebackers. So this wasn't like the starting duo of Barton and Okereke were just getting spelled by another consistent duo. We saw, again, the mixing and the matching, and I think if Stanford has realistic room for growth on defense, it's got to come from settling in on the linebackers, and the linebackers playing better. They just have to they have to figure out who their guys are, and then they've got to just roll with it. And I think that's got to be the formula, because like we said, no defensive end, none of these guys on the defensive line are going to become all-conference performers between now and the end of the season. I do think there are some potential all-conference performers in the linebacking group.
Yep. Yeah, and you play to your strengths. We've seen Stanford do it before. I think this is not the first time the defensive line has been thin, but it definitely is more dire than in years past. But I could give examples where Stanford has succeeded in situations that may resemble this or maybe related to the one. 2013 comes to mind. They went to the Rose Bowl that year. Ben Gardner was just getting beaten up to the point where after he tore his pectoral muscle or whatever it was, he was done. That unit was paper thin at that point. The 3 or 4 of those guys were injured. I think David Perry might have been playing with a sports hernia or something like that year. I don't even know if that was disclosed at the time. So you were playing, I think, with a defensive line that was about 40 or 50% of its projected strength that season. What Stanford did is they ran a lot of 2 defensive lineman sets with a big nickel package that year. You remember Joe Hemscott, the linebacker? He was the nickel back. So they went to nickel because they had to match up with all these spread teams in the Pac-12, but they also didn't want to compromise their sturdiness against the run. So the extra guys that they brought out there were kind of linebackers who were, meaty enough to get in there and get in on the run, but also athletic enough to play the pass. They had to get creative, and obviously that comes with its drawbacks. It comes with the risks, and you're not going to be as sturdy against the run as if you have 3 healthy defensive linemen up there in the 3-4. But it was something they had to do, and Lance Anderson was able to scheme around some problems, and they're going to have to start doing that kind of stuff again this season, just because it's right in front of you. There's a shortage of bodies, of capable, mature, man-strength bodies there, and USC's offensive line just pushed them around today. Yeah,
and I think, as we maybe head towards the finish line here tonight, I think we got a few more things to talk about, but one thing I think should be stressed is that I would argue that once more this game did not define what Stanford's going to be this year necessarily. I think that it certainly defined where they are right now against an elite team. But I think there is room to grow here, and I think there's a lot of things that Stanford can work on and do. I don't think they're going to look like this when they play Washington and Washington State. I don't think they're going to look like this when they play Notre Dame to close out the season. So losing to USC sucks. It just does. And losing in the Coliseum is awful. But again, whereas 2015, that team did come in here and define itself. I don't think that happened here tonight. I think that this is just where USC and Stanford are right now, and I think USC's on a great trajectory. But I think they're also a little vulnerable. I think I'm not sold on their run defense at this point. Certainly in a game where the other team can stay with the run, I'm not sure. We saw it last week, right?
You really need a counter threat, and I thought, that was that you could possible, running the ball. And Stanford was they made USC look non-competitive early on a couple of those pitch plays. I mean, guys were flattened, guys were on their back. The Love touchdown, that was, beautifully executed.
He was literally untouched for 75 yards.
Yeah, the lineman did a great job, over on the left side, but it was Daniel Marks who took out 3 guys with one block, and then the other way, too, when Love had that big run that was on the near side. That was extremely well executed. But at some point, every defense is going to get sick of getting embarrassed, and they're just going to say, fine, we don't want to get beat this way. We're going to put 9 or 10 guys up near the line of scrimmage, beat us another way. And the problem is that Stanford started trying to beat USC in that other way one drive too late. Once they were down 35-14 was the score? Or 35-17. It was 35-17 when Stanford went on that drive when they started getting really aggressive throwing the ball. When they probably should have done that when it was 28-17, but they were still trying to pitch their way to first downs against goal line defenses at the time.
Right.
And I get it because they had so much success earlier, but you have to be on the cutting edge. You have to be the one that makes the adjustment first, because if USC makes the adjustment first, which they did, and you don't react in time, that's too explosive of an offense, and all of a sudden you're down 18 points, and you're in trouble. You're behind the 8 ball.
Yeah, I think that what happened out there doesn't require too much analysis in terms of the tactics and the realities of it. I think that there's work to be done, and I do want to point out just a couple things that shouldn't get lost, which is Stanford showcased some guys tonight that I think are going to help them for quite a while. I liked what I saw from Connor Weddington.
Yeah,
I thought he looked like he belonged out there. I thought he played well. Let's see, what did he?
He's the Swiss Army knife.
What did he finish with? 3 catches for 29 yards as I almost fall off the Coliseum. That would have been the mother of all podcast endings right there. How bad was the night in the Coliseum? Well, it had fatalities. Yeah, no, all right. So it wasn't bad. I'm still alive. But look, I liked what I saw from Connor Weddington. Stanford's got talent. They've got things they can develop. They've got things that they can work. And so the question now becomes, where do they go from here? And if we know this staff and we know what the party line's going to be, always move forward, don't look back, always focus, and so on and so forth. I think Saturday night in San Diego now becomes a very, very interesting game to me, because what kind of ground can they gain in a week to be good enough to beat San Diego State, right? They don't have to get good enough to beat USC, but they have to be good enough to beat San Diego State on the road. It's not a rivalry game. It's just kind of a business trip for them. So, they're going to have to summon up their own chip on their shoulder. We saw a very salty and focused Justin Reed in the press conference. So they know the right things to say, and I think they know the right things to do. I'm just curious to see what do they bring next Saturday.
Yeah, and they could say all the right things, but sometimes you also face a very unpleasant truth, and that's our defensive linemen are not matured, strong enough yet to face the top offensive lines in the country.
Right.
That David Shaw, said, I'm not used to saying that today, when he said, I'm not used to getting outrushed by another team the way that we did today. And reading him, he's not going to call out his own guys, but reading in between the lines, he was saying, I'm not used to, having my defensive line get its ass kicked, and my the way that happened today. Because the offensive line, I thought we saw some very impressive run blocking, and the offense wasn't horrible. Then there's a lot of room for growth. I think you could leave the game with an optimistic feeling, as we've just been talking about for a few minutes. But defensively, there was a little feeling of, oh boy, is the cupboard bare here? Are we going to have to wait about a year to see Stanford have the man strength there to bring back old times? That's what's most unnerving about this. So the good news, though, is that Shaw said maybe it's just USC playing really well on the offensive line. I think it's a case of both. I think it was Stanford not being really ready for the moment yet, being weak there, and USC playing well. So the good news is that you're not playing USC every week. So hopefully that defensive line can develop and grow into the job against more manageable competition as the season goes along.
All right. Well, I think that's going to wrap it up here from the Coliseum. It was Stanford's first loss here since 2013. It's their first loss to USC since 2014. It never feels good, but it was only game 2, and there will be lots more to see and lots more to talk about from this Stanford football team as we move forward. So, for David Lombardi, this is RJ Abadia saying good night from the Los Angeles Coliseum, and we'll talk to you again, Stanford fans.